This conference will now be recorded.
All right, so chapter 41, incident management. So as we know, just not so much as just being like in charge, commanding incident management, how we're going to control the scene. As you're becoming an AEMT, you may be the highest license level on the truck where you have to manage that incident and kind of run the show. You're going to be the one in charge. You're going to be the one they're looking up to saying, hey, you're ALS. What do you want us to do? So that's, and the BLS providers are going to look for that guidance from you to help them get to where they need to be in the call. A lot of times, if you're double basic, then obviously the senior provider. But when you're AEMT or paramedic, you're kind of taking charge of the call. So if you're running with a system that you work with some of the fire personnel that are not licensed, they all look to you for the answers of what needs to happen with patient care and how you're going to manage that scene and manage that incident, manage that patient. So the most challenging situations are disasters and mass casualty incident MCIs. Something that we don't train a lot with. We do not do a lot of this stuff. EMT, the paramedic, I can tell you right now in the classes, there's one slideshow presentation that covers mass casualty. They kind of expect you to get that kind of stuff through real world situations. However, with that being said, that makes it very difficult because we don't see a ton of massive MCIs. But to you, what is an MCI? What would that be to you guys? How do you determine that the scene is going to be an MCI?
More patients than you can handle.
With the resources you have available. Yep, exactly. So you could have a 2-car accident with 4 patients, one ambulance on scene, everybody walking around, no injuries, wouldn't be an MCI. But once you put 2 priority 1s and 2 priority 2 patients, and you only have 2 providers, now we have more patients or criticality of patients and resources that it can handle. Now we're in an MCI situation until, yeah, one patient could be considered critical as well, depending on status of patient. So disaster refers to any situation that overwhelms your resources that you have, any kind of disaster, whether it be a hurricane comes through, tornado comes through, to a massive blizzard that has massive power outages where you have multiple patients you may have to respond out to. That disaster. MCI incident refers to a situation where more than one patient, but which will not overwhelm available resources that you have, people coming in. So there's no set numerical cutoff at which a multiple casualty incident becomes an MCI. There's no number, right? With the MCI, the number of patients and severity of injury suggests that available resources could be overwhelmed, depending on what we have. I've been to my share of MCIs over the last 20 plus years, where we've had motor vehicle accidents, where we've had multiple patients, or if you have an apartment building fire, multiple patients coming back out, things like that. So you may come in contact with one of those. I mean, we've seen our share where I work now, just on Route 16 alone, where we've had MCIs. So incidents with large number of patients require a systematic approach to manage the incident. So using the principles of the ICS, or Incident Command System, we're going to be able to do that. So the National Incident Management System, or NIMS, was developed to promote efficient coordination of emergency incidents at a regional, state, and national level. Working together in a unified command, which means working with police, fire, EMS, and so forth, to be able to manage a situation utilizing a incident management structure as well. I don't want to go too far ahead yet. So the Secretary of the Homeland Security implemented the National Incident Management System, or the NIMS, in 2004. This got away from, and I hate to, PD still uses them, but 10 codes, and going to a plain language, plain English system to provide a consistent nationwide approach to incident management. So this used to prepare for, prevent, respond. This is used to prepare, prevent, respond to, and recover from domestic incidents, regardless of cause, size, or complexity. There are two underlying principles of NIMS that are flexibility and standardization. Like I mentioned before, everything had to become standardized, so we had interoperability between multiple different systems. So terminology, resource classification, personnel training, and certification. So they offered all these different classes online. Now, New Hampshire EMS, to be part of the class for an EMT, require you to have your incident management system or NIMS training 100 and 700, along with your AWR or hazmat awareness 160. And this helps with that interoperability and that standardization of how a scene is going to run if it's a large scale. So the components of NIMS are fundamentals and concepts of NIMS, resource management, what you have and how you're going to manage it out, command and coordination, somebody being in charge with operations sector officers moving down to company officers, and everybody has a specific task to be able to be issued to get a job done. That way there it's all coordinated. If you look at wildland firefighting, they manage thousands and thousands of firefighters under one person being in charge of a specific fire. And they break it down. There's all different forms you can use as well. The ICS like 201, 202, 200, 204, 203, all the different forms that are out there that can be utilized to help manage a situation that's actually there. And also communication and information management as well. How we're going to communicate. Imagine trying to communicate with 1,000 EMS personnel on a call. How can that even be effectively done? So they said something called span of control. So they recommend, based on span of control, for every 5 to 7 firefighters or EMS providers, there's one company officer in charge of every 5 to 7 providers that are there. And then it branches down to, 5 to 7 officers underneath like a task or a strike team leader, which then go to a task force that oversees all the strike team leaders that go out, and it can keep branching down. So when I worked for AMR back in the day, I was a task force leader for the disaster response team, where if I was deployed out, I would oversee a task force with a bunch of strike teams underneath me. And that's kind of how that's supposed to work. And then those are major incidents, right? So we look at the fundamentals and concepts in resource management. We have to understand how incident management systems work. And there's different classes on top of that. There's ICS 100, 200, 300, 400, 700, 800, and 701 through 706. There's other ones in the mix of all that as well, that you had to have to be a task force leader where I worked. So it was one of those things where you had to get all that additional training and move up into those different types of ranks to manage a bigger scale incident. So this is where the national incident management components come from. Other parts of ICS or incident command systems would be a standardized on-scene emergency management model. The purpose of the ICS is to enhance command, control, and communication abilities, ensure responder and public safety, achieve incident management goals, ensure the efficient use of the resources that are there, and treat patients during an emergency. We're going to break this down a little bit more. So this is designed to avoid duplication of effort and freelancing. Freelancing is what gets somebody killed. Just walk around with no accountability. So everybody's going to be assigned a task, and we're not going to have, and we could have, it says duplication. We may have different teams, and we can discuss this in the fire field all day long. This is an EMS class, so I got to break it down more towards the EMS side of stuff. But just to fight a building fire, we have exterior operations, interior operations, and they move to different floors or subdivisions. There's a lot of different things that are involved in this as far as communication to understand where people are at a scene to have effective management. So this refers to keeping the supervisor or worker ratio at 1 supervisor for every 3 to 7. I said 5 to 7. I don't know what books you're looking at, but 3 to 7 workers. So if we have let's say we're doing an event and they require us to have 5 ambulances there at two apiece plus additional personnel. If I was in charge of that and I had to have somebody overseeing operations if I was a commanding role, and that breaks down into every 3 to 7 EMS providers to a company officer assignment. So organizational levels may also include sections, branches, divisions, groups. These are kind of things that we would look at for even just setting up an event on where certain divisions or groups are going to be set up to manage effectively to get appropriate response times down. So if you're at a fair with, let's say, 50,000 people, we're not going to have all EMS in one spot. They could be broken down in different sectors for sector response, and then an ambulance will come in and do the transport. You may be in something like a Gator or a UTV of some sort to be able to respond at a faster and become faster and more efficient. So, excuse me. Incident command or system roles and responsibilities. General staff includes command, someone who's in charge. Finance and administration, right? Someone that can write the checkbook, and write the check. Logistics and operations, right? So planning, so we have command, finance, logistics, ops, all right? And then there's also planning personnel as well, but they kind of fall into the finance and planning administration role. So the incident commander, the IC, is in charge of the overall incident, the one that's in charge. You may have multiple incident commanders in a large scale incident. That's where we call something called unified command, where we have, like I said, we have someone like a fire chief, an EMS chief, and a police chief all show up together. We're not going to tell PD how to do their job. PD's not going to tell EMS how to do their job, and EMS is not going to tell fire how to do their job. So you have to have 3 different commanders that work together to make a decision as a commanding role. So a large-scale incident may use a multi-agency or multi-jurisdiction response and a unified command system. A single command system has one person in charge, even if multiple agencies are respond. All right, for a single command. If we use unified, then multiple people are in charge. Know who the IC is, how to communicate with that person, and where the command post is located. In a large incident, there's a command post that's set up, and the commanding officer does not leave that post. They stay there. Right? They depend on everybody showing up to know how to do their job and utilizing different sector officers to help manage that. Communication is important if a transfer of command takes place. So if I show up and I'm in command of a call and I want to, let's say someone else at higher rank shows up above me and they want to take over, it'll be known on the radio that I am then transferring command to the said provider. So when an incident draws to a close and a command structure is no longer necessary, termination of command should take place. On the radio, everybody's clear of the scene, command is being terminated. Now there's no more commanding officer anymore, and that's where they branch off and they go back. So implement demobilization procedures as a situation de-escalates or comes to an end. We demobilize the situation, and then after that we have an action incident review to kind of go over how it went, and there could be any changes for the next time it happens. Finance and administration are responsible for documenting all expenditures at an incident. Someone's going to have to take charge of how much things are going to cost. Finance administration personnel are not usually needed in smaller incidents, but large scale ones, they are. And a lot of times, if it's near smaller towns, the select board or selectmen would come in and they would run that finance side of it because they're the ones that have the checkbook. So functions within finance and administration section are a time unit, procurement unit, compensation and claims unit, and a cost unit. Logistics are responsible for communications equipment, facilities, food, water, fuel, lighting. If we need a resource, logistics can make that happen, right? These are all things for us as patients and emergency responders. If I need to have 20 more ambulances, that's actually a bad use of that. If I need to have, let's say, 2 pallets of water delivered to a major incident, logistics will handle that and make that happen, working with finance to make the payment to get that water delivered to us. In a large-scale incident or large incident, it is often necessary for many people to handle logistics, right? It may not be just be able to be done by one person. Operations are responsible for managing tactical operations. That's where things are happening. Extrication to triage to whatever. That's an operational stuff. Supervises people working at a scene as well. Planning solves problems as they arise. Planners, they analyze, investigate, and obtain data to see how things will work, develop objectives for an incident, and select a strategy to meet these objectives. They sit there and they plan for it, what's going on. Determine the resources needed to execute a plan. Going from daytime to nighttime may require more resources. They start planning that to get more people in. They need to work closely with the operations, finance, and especially logistics sections. So we had a major wildfire in New Hampshire that was burning 30,000 acres. We're not going to handle just one person. There's going to be all these different sectors that are going to come in to help manage those resources that we need. Incident action plan is the central tool for planning during the response to a disaster, having an IAP. The command staff, the safety officer monitors the scene for conditions or operations that may present a hazard to responders and patients. Safety officers are, as they are, they're safety officers. They can shut down an operation if they feel something's not safe. A PIO, or a public information officer, provides the public and media with a clear and understandable information. That's one of the most important on a scene, is your public information officer. That person is what talks to the media. They're the ones that sit there in front of the camera and have these discussions. If you have one that's dedicated or delegated at a scene, they handle that. If you walk up to a reporter as a fire chief or EMS officer, paramedic, and you say, I'll get back to you in 30 minutes with an update. If you don't go back within those 30 minutes and with an update, they're going to be, first of all, they'll be upset that you lied to them. Second of all, they're going to start making up media stories. They're going to start coming up with stuff to put on the media that could be false information. So if you tell them 30 minutes with an update, come back in 30 minutes with an update. But if you're in charge, how can you leave the scene to stop and talk in front of a camera? PIOs are important. Liaison officer relays information and concerns among command, general staff, and other agencies. They kind of relay information going around. Communication and information management historically has been the weak point for most major incidents is communication. Recommended that communications be integrated, so all agencies should be able to communicate quickly and effortlessly via radios. We all go to one frequency. We use plain English. I couldn't even tell you the 10 codes anymore, right? So we get away from those. Plain English, yes, no, affirmative, negative, all right? No more 10 4s, 10 5s, 10 7s, all these different things. We got to get away from that. Communications also allow for accountability throughout the incident as well, and instant communication between recipients. Mobilization and deployment. When an incident has been declared and the need for additional resources have been identified, the request is made for additional resources. What do we need? Point the other night, I know Rosa was there, and I think Sean was there as well, was the fire in Wolfboro we went to. We responded there as a rehab unit. But if you listen to the radio traffic, right, they declared the need for certain resources. They wanted a tanker task force, a tanker strike team. They got a bunch of water tankers to show up to the scene with water. They can request that. They can also use an ambulance task force if they had multiple patients there, where dispatch has a setup where they know who to dispatch if you request a level 1 MCI, level 2 MCI, level 3 MCI, and they know who to call and what resources are going to be deployed. Wait until the request is made before mobilizing and deploying, right? You can talk amongst each other and say, everyone at the station, hang out, wait for this to come out, but let's not start getting on the radios and signing on. Like, we shouldn't take ambulances and start responding to other towns until we're requested. On arrival, when you get there, check in with the incident commander. They may give you a order while responding to respond to like a secondary staging. If you have a major incident, you're not going to have all the ambulances all in one spot. You're going to have secondary and primary staging areas as well. And each place will have an operational officer running that. So it'll be like a secondary staging officer, primary staging officer, triage officer, all these different ones that are there. Incident record keeping as well. Notes that need to be taken. Record keeping also allows for tracking of the time spent on the incident for reimbursement purposes, because you do get paid for the incidents through insurance companies. Accountability. Keep your supervisor advised of your location, actions, and completed tasks. We need to make sure we know where you are and what's been done. Advise the supervisor of tasks that you have been unable to complete and what tools you need to complete them. Incident demobilization allows for prompt return of resources to their parent organizations to be placed back in service. So EMS response within the ICS system. Preparedness involves decisions made and basic planning done before an incident occurs. There should be pre-plans in place. EMS agencies should have a written disaster plan, that's our pre-planning, that you are regularly trained to carry out. EMS services should also have a mutual aid response agreements with neighboring EMS communities. If you run out of resources, what we call level 0, there's nothing left in the town, who do we have coming in next? All groups with mutual aid response agreements should practice using their plans frequently, right? And also re-upping their mutual aid agreements, whether it be on a yearly basis or a 5-year basis, whatever it may be, but having that re-up to make sure. Sometimes fire departments or EMS services buy different equipment, and if you don't know about it, how can you call for that resource? Scene size up starts with dispatch. Okay, that's when it starts. And scene size up never changes until you clear the call, because you're always reviewing the scene for safety. If dispatch indicates a possible unsafe scene, stay away or get only close enough to make an assessment. Right, driven by 3 basic questions. What do I have? Assess for hazards, establish whether an incident, whether the incident is open or closed. Estimate the number of casualties. Now, question number 2, what resources do I need? We're going to decide what resources are needed. And number 3 is, what do I need to do? Safety, incident stabilization, preservation of property and the environment. Establishing command. Established by the most senior official. The command system ensures that the resources are effectively and efficiently coordinated. This must be established early, preferably by the most experienced public safety officer that we have. Officials may include police, fire, or EMS. Right, someone has to be in charge. Now, if we go to a scene, this is more towards whether it be EMS, mutual aid coming in, private EMS, doesn't really matter. Someone's going to be in command of the call, and doesn't necessarily have to be the paramedic or the AEMT. An EMT can be in command, but the highest license level is in charge of patient care, and you have to work together. So if I show up myself to a town where I work, we're a private ambulance service. We're not going to take command of a call. Fire's going to show up, they're going to establish command, but they're not going to tell me how patient care needs to be done. That's my job. And if I need a resource, I relay that to command saying, I need this. Their job is to coordinate and make that happen. It keeps one person on the radio, or there it's not cluttered, and allows people to get what we need to the scene. If multiple people make requests, dispatch centers get confused and they don't know what to do. We don't want that to happen. If possible, use face-to-face communication to limit radio traffic. Equipment must be reliable, durable, and field tested. Be sure to have backup plans in place. Have a plan B in case of communication failure. How are we going to get information out? As far as medical incident command is the medical or EMS branch of the ICS. As you can look at here on the screen. So you see EMS branch is here. This is where your incident commander is going to be. And then that branches down in different sectors. At the incidents that have significant medical factor, IC should appoint a medical branch director. Supervisors or supervisors primary roles of the medical branch: triage, treatment, and transport of injured people. Who's going to go out and do the initial assessment? Right, that's your triage. Who's going to set up the treatment areas, looking at your green, yellow, red, and black? And who's going to be in charge of transport as coordinating ambulances coming in and where they're going to be transporting to? And they all play a huge part. Okay, we'll get into this stuff here in the next couple of slides. Each medical group receives a clear assignment before beginning work, and personnel remain with their vehicles in the staging area until duties are assigned. The triage supervisor is in charge of counting and prioritizing patients, which ensure every patient receives initial assessment of their condition. This is how we tell what color they may be, whether it be, like I said, green, yellow, red, and black. The treatment supervisor locates and sets up treatment areas with a tier for each priority of patient. Ensure that the secondary triage of patients are also performed and adequate patient care is given. So once the patient has been triaged, primary triage, they go to their treatment area for the green, yellow, red, and black. At that point in time, there'll be EMS providers in those different sectors or that are in there in the triage area, and they can do a secondary triage to see if a patient is getting worse or is a patient getting better, and they get moved to a different area. This assists with moving patients to the transportation area, and the transportation supervisor coordinates transportation and distribution of patients to the appropriate receiving hospitals. Now, we don't have a major hospital in our area that can take 30 patients, right? That couldn't even happen. So the transport officer or supervisor needs to call around to every area hospital and say, how many patients can you take and what level of patient can you take? And they may say, well, we can take 1 red critical patient, 2 yellows, and 5 greens. So they put them in, the greens are walking wounded. They can sit in a waiting area, right? And you have to be able to document it and chart all this stuff to know where this patient is going to go. And then once you go, and then they go to transport, you have to document where that patient was transported to for accountability. All right, so Justin, I just saw your message. What are you asking for? Sorry, as far as.
So couldn't you tap into Remus to get ideas on who can take what for patients?
They could, yes. So for Maine, it might be a good option to tap into Remus at Maine Medical Center to have them help. But over in New Hampshire, that wouldn't work at all because they're too far away. Now you could call them and say, hey, what can your main hospitals take? But for us to transport to main hospitals, our closest ones for where we are would be Maine Med and Sanford, maybe.
Sanford, Biddeford, yeah, and York.
Those are longer away hospitals where we have, Concord, Lakes, Franklin, Memorial, Huggins, Wentworth Douglas, all the freestanding ERs where we have an area that I work in. So really, you have to know the area you're in, right, to understand who you're going to utilize, who you're going to call. Just have dispatch do that would be kind of a pain because they're too busy dispatching other stuff going out. So they're not the ones that are going to have to make those calls. So in all fairness, the transportation supervisor should have like either a cell phone or an iPad with all these numbers programmed in them to be able to start making these calls, right? Even if it's a prepaid phone that you can let sit there or that the minutes do not expire, if you ever find one like that, and it sits there charging or whatever it may be, so the transportation officer can have one of those. If you were an assistant that had a ton of MCIs, that'd be worth it, But for us up here, we don't see those. A lot of us have the local hospitals numbers that are in there. Does that make sense, everybody? It's a lot to coordinate. It's not just something that's simple. It's a lot of coordination to see where patients are going to go. All right. You also need to document and track the number of transport vehicles, patients transported, facility destinations for each vehicle and patient. The last thing you need is family to show up looking for their child, and you say, I don't know, they went by ambulance somewhere. One of the 20 hospitals they transported to. That's why you need to have an understanding where everything goes. That's where those triage tags come into play. Then you can track them with triage tags. A staging supervisor is assigned when an MCI or disaster requires a multi-vehicle or multi-agency response, where people can go and stage to not overpopulate the actual incident, that hot zone. This gives permission to the emergency vehicles to enter and drive in directed areas. Ambulances will stage here and they'll move forward to this next point. Trying to think. Justin, were you on the Stanford hoax? You were there for that, right?
Yeah, I was one of the responders and heading that way.
Yes. All right. So were you actually on the scene for that or no?
Yes, we made it to the scene. We were team 4 going in.
Right. So there had to, so for that type of thing, even a school shooting or possible shooting in a school, And obviously, I was involved in that because we got called from Tamworth to go over with ambulances too. They had a multi-agency response, correct?
Oh, yes. State,
Yes.
local, federal, regional, county, anyone and everyone that could come out.
How many ambulances were there that you can remember?
I can think of at least 30 that we saw in our staging area.
Right. So could you imagine if everybody responded directly to the school? Right. This is why
We had
stage.
people running in.
Yeah. So everything is coordinated on entrance and exit of vehicles. It just so happened that they moved everybody to a different location, and then we had more patients there than we actually did in the school itself, which turned into a nightmare. But they looked at it as an after incident review and found a better way to handle that later on. But they did a good job all around, just setting stuff up. So you can tell that people train with this stuff all the time. And again, we talked about, who was talking about this with, but we talked about like 1%ers. Train with the stuff that you don't see a lot of, right? We're all good at putting bandages on. We're all good at doing IVs. We're all good at doing assessments. When was the last time out of this group that someone truly had to put on a traction splint? When was the last time that someone went to a school shooting? When was the last time that someone went to an MCI? And these are the 1 or 2%ers I talk about that we don't get a lot of high volume with, but for some reason we never train with it, right? And that's where things become a problem. So I'm sorry, I got a little off topic there, but I wanted to kind of make that a point that we need to train and look at these different plans. The physicians on scene make triage decisions if you have a physician that shows up. Provide secondary triage decisions in treatment areas, and provide on-scene medical direction and provide care. To have a physician there to be able to do those medical control orders, they're there as your medical control to make those decisions for you, to help you with that. Rehabilitation supervisor establishes an area that provides protection for responders from the elements and situation, right? And you can see that if we had a major incident, do we need, and especially when it's colder out, do we need to have tents come in and set up? And where do we get those from? Right? That's where your planning and your finance people come in to write those checks to get those people to show up with the stuff that we need. Right? High risk, exactly. High risk, low frequency stuff that we come in contact with. Exactly. So it should be located away from exhaust fumes and crowds. Last thing you want to do is set up your rehab area where all the trucks are running and you get carbon monoxide poisoning. Yeah, York Smart Truck, exactly. That's a good resource to have for food and everything else. And it has a little command area inside of it too, I believe. Monitors responders for signs of physical and or emotional stress, including post-traumatic stress disorder or cumulative type of stress it does. Extrication and special rescue. The extrication supervisor or rescue supervisor determines the type of equipment that is resources that are needed, usually function underneath the medical branch of the ICS, right? There are a lot of people that are really good at doing extrication that may not be EMS trained, so they got to work with us, we got to work with them. When I teach my extrication classes, that's the way that works. Right? I teach my EMS providers to work in conjunction with fire to get the patient out because we know what's going to happen. You can't just rip a patient out of a vehicle, right? They work with us in ways to get the patient out to keep them alive. The morgue supervisor coordinates removal of bodies and body parts. Leave dead patients in the location they are found if possible until a removal or a storage plan can be determined. The morgue area should be out of view of living patients and other responders and secured from the public. So the mass casualty incident, or MCI, refers to any call that can overwhelm available community resources, any situation that requires a mutual aid response. So we're going to consider whether the call is an MCI. How many seriously injured patients or ill patients can effectively treat and transport in the ambulance? 1 or 2. What happens when I have multiple patients to manage? How long will it take for additional help to arrive? And what happens if the number of patients exceeds the number of available ambulances? Right? This is where triage starts getting set up. This is where the MCI is now established. Right? Those are some questions you want to ask yourself to determine, yes, this is an MCI. When you have determined that this is an MCI, you need to get on the radio with dispatch and say, we're establishing an MCI. That way there, a lot of our protocols or our policies can be changed, right? This changes a lot of things when it becomes an MCI as far as treatment goes. That way there, you can't be blamed for abandoning a patient because it's an MCI and you got to treat everybody by doing triage. So this is a diagram of a mass casualty incident. The incident command system established at the scene of a building fire. They look very similar to this diagram, right? So incident here, right? This is the extrication area coming out to triage. They're being triaged at this point in time to be able to go to the green, yellow, or red, right? If there was a black, they'd probably set them up somewhere, farther away from the incident where dead bodies go, right? Now, immediate, we'll get ambulance transport out. Red tags go to the closest hospital. Yellow tags go a little bit farther out. As you can see here, these are more delayed, and these are treatment areas where green, where patients can be treated and kind of just be released. Or if they need to go to the hospital, we can transport multiple at once. So what is something we can utilize to get patients to a hospital? Yeah, buses. Does an EMT have to be on that bus, or is that considered abandonment if you throw them in a bus and send them on their way? So we don't have to have anybody on that bus at all. Nothing. Once they've been determined that they're in the green, we don't have to get patient refusals. Patient refusals are not needed in an MCI, right? We just got to be able to establish where people are, and we can kind of send them on their way, right? If they're greens and we establish and treat and triage them, we can put them onto a bus and say we're going to take all these greens to whatever, Portsmouth, I don't know, right? They go on a bus, they go to the hospital, right? Yellows, obviously, they're going to be going by ambulance. Red are by ambulance, but the greens are not transported by ambulance. We do not need to take them there by that. But again, you have to establish that MCI. If you don't, then it's called abandoning a patient. If there are multiple patients and not enough resources to handle them without abandoning victims, declare the MCI, request additional resources, and initiate the ICS and triage procedures. Triage is the sorting of patients based on severity of injuries. Triage assessment is brief, and patient conditions categories are basic. Primary triage is the initial triage done in the field. We go around, we triage people, put tags on them, and we move them to where they need to go based on the color. Secondary triage or re-triaging is done as patients are brought to the treatment area. So they're sitting in the treatment area, and we go down and reassess them again. Do they need to go to red? Do they need to stay in green? Could a yellow become a green, depending on patient status? Possibly. During primary triage, patients are briefly assessed and identified by an attaching triage tag or triage tape. The tags are a lot better, so we can put more information down on there. The main information needed is a unique number or a triage category and a triage category. So there's a unique number based on every tag. After the primary triage, the triage supervisor may communicate the following information to the medical branch director: total number of patients, total number of patients in each triage category, recommendations for extrication and movement of patients to the treatment area, and resources needed to complete a triage and begin movement of patients. How we're going to start mobilizing these different sectors to get them to the hospital. So there are triage categories. There are usually 4 common. First one's immediate or red. First priority patients need immediate care and transport. Yellow is delayed. These are your second priority patients, need treatment and transport, but it can be delayed. You usually have multiple injuries or bones or joints, including back injuries with or without spinal cord injury. You have your minor or minimal, which is the green, which is a hold. These are your third priority patients, may require no field or only minimal treatments. Injuries are usually soft tissue. And then your expectant, which is your black tag, or likely to die or dead. This is your last priority. Patients who are dead or those who are injuries are so severe they have minimal chance of survival, they get put in the black. This may include patients who are in cardiac arrest or who have an open head injury. If limited resources are available, may also include patients with respiratory arrest. So they're no longer breathing with some pulse. You know what? You got to move on to the next one. You can't sit there and try to help them. And that's where the hardest part is by walking away from that patient that maybe you could have saved, but again, they're so far beyond that point that you expect them to die or moving forward. Patients receive treatment and transport only after patients in one of the three categories have received care, right? So we don't take them to the hospital until they've been treated in one of those triage areas. So there's different tagging systems. A lot of the ambulances are gone to this one here. Almost circle down there. Versus the other normal tags as you see there, okay? These ones here, if a patient is red, there's no way to make them better because you can't add on to the tag, you can only take away. Where this one here is a folding system, where you write things down inside and they fold. You could take a priority 1 and then refold it back to show priority 2, which is yellow. So you can actually upgrade your tags that way versus the other ones where you can't. So there's different positives to these. But triaging patients early and assists in tracking them to help keep an accurate record of their condition. Should be weatherproof and easily read, right? So don't use regular paper. They should be waterproof paper or weatherproof somehow so they don't get ruined. The patient tags or tape should be color coded and should clearly show the category of the patient. You really can't miss these. Priority 1, 2, and 3, or 4, which is dead. This is also part of the patient's medical record as well. So this is called a START triage system. That's one a lot of the states have adopted. It's simple triage and rapid transport. Very simple. Literally, it's a very simple triage system. Limited assessment on patient's ability to walk, respiratory status, hemodynamic status, pulses, and neurological status. The first step is calling out to the patient and directing them to an easily identified landmark. Green. That's your green area. Can you walk to me? If you can walk, you're a green. So the first step is calling out. Persons in this group are walking wounded are considered a green or priority. Second step of the START triage process is directed towards the non-walking patients. Oh, I just moved that forward. I apologize. There we go. So the second step is move the non-ambulatory patients and assess respiratory status. If the patient is not breathing, open the airway by using a simple maneuver. If the patient, a patient who does not begin to breathe after remaneuvering the airway is expectant, black, okay, they're gonna die. If the patient begins to breathe, tag them as a red, put them in the recovery position, go to the next patient. That's how fast this triage actually works. We're not putting in oral airways, we're not doing nasal airways, there's no BVMs, right? They don't even want you doing tourniquets. Just move forward. Right now, if you carry tourniquets on, you throw one on and keep moving. And that's my own personal opinion on that. If the patient is breathing, make a quick estimation of the respiratory rate. If the patient is breathing faster than 30 breaths a minute or slower than 10, it is triaged as an immediate priority red. If the patient is breathing between 10 and 29 breaths per minute, move into the next step of the START process. Assess your hemodynamic status by checking for bilateral radial pulses. If an absent radial pulse implies the patient is hypotensive and should be triaged as an immediate priority. If you do not have a radial pulse by PHTLS, your blood pressure is less than 90 systolic. If you have a carotid pulse, it's right around 60, right, with no radials. If radial pulse is present, go to the next step. Assess the patient's neurological status by assessing the patient's ability to follow simple commands. A patient who is unresponsive or cannot follow simple commands is an immediate priority, red. A patient who complies should be triaged in the delayed category, yellow. Right? So for pediatrics, what they call jump start for pediatric was intended use for children younger than 8 years of age who appear to be less than 100 pounds or 45 kilos. This begins identified by walking wounded. Infants or children are not developed enough to walk or follow commands should be taken as soon as possible to the treatment area for a secondary triage. The difference between respiratory status assessment compared with START. If a pediatric patient is not breathing, immediately check a pulse. If there is no pulse, label the patient as an expectant black. If the patient is not breathing but has a pulse, open the airway with a manual maneuver. If the patient does not begin to breathe, give 5 rescue breaths, then check respirations again. A child who does not begin to breathe should be labeled as expectant, black. All right. We're going to assess the approximate rate of respiration. So a patient breathing fewer than 15 breaths or more than 45 is a red. In between those numbers it requires further assessment. Assess the hemodynamic status. The patient has an absent distal pulse. Label the child as an immediate priority. If the distal pulse is present, move on to the next assessment, which is the neurological status using a modified AVPU score, which is utilized, which is on the paperwork for you when you have it. A child who is unresponsive and responds to pain by posturing or with incomprehensible sounds or is unable to localize pain is tagged as an immediate priority. A child who responds to pain by localizing it or withdrawing from it or is alert and is considered a delayed priority patient. For special considerations in triage, hysterical and disruptive patients may need to be handled as an immediate red and transported out of the MCI or disaster site, even if not seriously injured, if they're hysterical. A responder who becomes sick or injured during the rescue effort should be handled as an immediate priority and transported as soon as possible. Hazmat and weapons of mass destruction incidents force the hazmat team to identify patients as contaminated or decontaminated before a regular triage process. When we're triaging patients, they're going to decontaminate them first before they move out into the cold zone. With hazmat, there's 3 different areas. There's hot zone, that's where your technicians work, that's where things are happening. They bring patients out into the warm zone where the decontamination process starts, whether it be gross decon, utilizing ladder pipes and showering patients naked as they walk through, or they're using individual decon by going through different tubs and scrubbing with soap and water wherever it needs to be done appropriately to rinse off and clean off whatever material could be on there. So there's a long process. This is a whole separate class when you start getting into decontamination process. That's what they call hazmat ops. They teach you about the decon stuff and also assisting with the technician team to go in. As far as destination decisions go, all patients triaged as an immediate should be transported by ground ambulance or air ambulance if available. Another thing to think about too, if you're calling for multiple helicopters, which happened at the Sanford incident, I think what did they have, Justin? 2 or 3 coming in? I can't remember what it was, but they had quite a bit. I don't remember off the top of my head. It might have been 2, but you got to find a place to land them. So you also got to think about landing zone setups. Now, plan for at least one responder to ride on the bus if they or have an ambulance follow, like Tandra mentioned early. If we don't have the availability, then obviously they're just going to ship them on a bus without it. But your buses may be used to transport the walking wounded, right? Immediate priority patients should be transported 2 at a time. The patients should be delayed category should be transported 2 or 3 at a time. Now, if we have reds and they talk about transporting 2 at a time, you may not be able to do that. 3, thank you, Justin. You may not be able to do that because a lot of these ambulances now are being designed for 1 patient transport. They've gotten rid of the bench seat that you can strap a second patient down on a board, right? A lot of them have gone to more work action areas for the ALS provider or BLS provider to sit. Early notification dead patients are handled and transported accordingly, according to the standard operating procedure for the area. Where do bodies go? Early notification to receiving facilities will allow for hospitals to increase staffing and move patients within their facility as required. So you have to notify them early so they can do their callbacks for people to come in. As far as disaster management, to finish up, the disaster is a widespread event that disrupts the functions and resources of a community and threatens lives and property. As you can see, flooding, fires, hurricanes result in widespread injuries that we can't even get out in certain situations. Blizzards. So responders will generally be on scene of a disaster for days or weeks and sometimes months. Right, and that's where these disaster response teams come in, like the one I worked for with AMR was like that. They had a disaster response team that could literally mobilize 200 ambulances if they wanted to. They're sitting in airplane hangars in 2 parts of the state where they have hundreds of trucks just sitting there, equipped and ready to go. So respond when requested and report to the IC for the assigned task. In a disaster with an overwhelming number of casualties, area hospitals decide that they cannot treat all patients in their facilities. They need to mobilize medical and nursing teams with equipment. So what they'll do is they'll come out with massive tents, and they'll bring nursing teams, doctors, physicians, whatever, and they'll be at these mobile tents where you can bring patients to those so they can start doing treatment in the field. Because hospitals, they only have certain many rooms, but tents, you can get multiple tents as long as you have the staff to staff it. And a lot of times in these, they may take paramedics as well, or advanced EMTs that can do IVs and fluids and put them to work treating patients inside an immobilized unit or a tent. This may use a facility such as a warehouse, disasters, whatever it may be. Warehouses work really well, schools, gymnasiums, and they bring cots in and you start treating on cots. This, when they're there, as far as the casualty collection area, need to perform triage, perform medical care, and transfer patients to the hospitals on a priority basis. If a casualty collection area is established, it'll be coordinated through the incident command system as well. All right. Any questions on that at all? No? What time is it now?
This conference will now be recorded.
All right, so chapter 42, terrorism response and disaster management. So the question is not will terrorists strike again, but rather when and where they will strike. So it's difficult to plan and anticipate for a response to many terrorist events, yet there are several key principles that apply to every response. Right? So what is terrorism to you guys? What is it? What would your thoughts be? It doesn't have to be textbook. We want to take a stab at it?
Anything that incites fear and panic in the general public, general population.
Okay. Hostile acts to cause upset of the day-to-day. Any threat to the public? Yeah.
Could be a
So-
backpack. It could be a backpack left on a bench in a populated area.
Okay. So terrorists pose a threat to nations and cultures everywhere. So the U.S. Department of Justice defines terrorism with 3 points, right? Involves violent acts or acts dangerous to human life that violate federal or state law, appears to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, influence policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, and affect conduct of a government by mass destruction, like assassinations or kidnapping. So international terrorism is committed by people associated with or inspired by a defined terrorist organization or nation. Domestic terrorism is also committed by people hoping to further ideological causes relevant to national issues. So only a small percentage of groups actually turn towards terrorism as a means to achieve their goals. So violent religious groups, doomsday cults, things like that, seek apocalyptic violence or mass murder. Extremist political groups or violent separatist groups, and those who seek political, religious, economic, or social freedom. Cyber terrorists or tactical population technological infrastructure, or a single issue group, or include like anti-abortion groups or animal rights groups, anarchists, racists, or even things like that, looking at those single issue type problems where they come up with a terrorist type attack. Individual terrorist and active shooter events. A new trend of domestic terrorism involves a concept that the lone wolf terrorist attack. And some most devastating attacks in the U.S. soil in recent years have been these types. Attacks may target schools, music festivals, or even shopping centers that have been difficult to predict. 2015, Emmanuel Church shooting in Charleston, South Carolina. The Pulse nightclub shooting in 2016 in Orlando. 2017, Las Vegas, Nevada shooting at the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival. So active shooter events. Lone wolf terrorist attacks that involves firearms instead of explosives. So the Hartford census, in 2013, the American College of Surgeons Committee's recommendations of best practices for survival. This is what they call THREAT, the THREAT acronym. Threat suppression, hemorrhage control, rapid extrication to safety, assessment by medical providers, and transport to definitive care. Other recommendations by the Hartford consensus is care begins with immediate responders. So early hemorrhage control. For those of you that are out there that work in the field, how many services now are carrying bulletproof vests that actually have the trauma pouches in the front of them? Who's carrying those now? All right, Justin, I know you have your own. How many tourniquets are you guys carrying on those now? Yeah, 2 to 4. Yeah, that sounds about right. So reevaluate, so early hemorrhage control, that's where that tourniquet stuff comes into place. You have your own. Yeah, I have like 4 in my vehicle myself. Reevaluation of practice of staging away from the scene. Rescue task force to provide more rapid care. Many EMS organizations have revised their roles and responsibilities of personnel responding to an active shooter event. So enters the warm zone, but not the hot zone. Incorporates EMS crews with law enforcement teams, their interagency training, them going in with them as part of a, like a SWAT medic type deal, going in with these different teams. AEMTs need to maintain a high degree of situational awareness for these types of situations, prepare mentally and physically to respond to these types of events, and support educating immediate responders to assist saving lives. There's different programs above and beyond the AEMT that you can take, like TCCC stuff, things like that involve combat care as well. Those are for you to use, yeah, for yourself as well. So weapon of mass destruction, WMD, or weapon of mass destruction or mass casualty with WMC, designed to bring about mass death, casualties, and massive damage to property and the infrastructure. So we look at different acronyms like BNICE or CBRN, CBRNE, or mnemonics to remember the kinds of WMD. So BNICE would be biologic, nuclear, incendiary, chemical explosive, or chemical, biologic, radiologic, nuclear explosive. Different ways you can look at them. You're probably going to see a lot of this stuff here in your operational section of your National Registry exam. You'll probably see things like this as well. So kind of take note. Terrorist groups have favored tactics that use explosive devices. So truck bombs or pedestrian suicide bombers, attempts to use chemical or biological weapons have been unsuccessful. So they're going to send people out for bomb. Look at the marathon bombing in Boston, same thing. WMDs are relatively easy to obtain and create. So technical instructions for making WMDs can be found even on the internet. So again, readily available, easily found. As far as chemical terrorism warfare, chemical agents are manufactured substances that have a devastating effect on living organisms. Produced in a liquid gas or a solid form, depending on the desired route of exposure, dissemination technique. This consists of like blister agents, choking agents, cyanides, nerve agents, all different things that could these could consist of as far as an airborne, let's say pathogen that gets out, or not pathogen, but airborne chemical as far as the terrorism or warfare goes. Biological terrorism warfare would be biologic agents causing diseases for terrorist use. Cultivated, synthesized, and mutated in the laboratory. So the primary lab would be the virus, bacteria, or toxins. So I mean, we kind of COVID, right? This could have spread very rapidly as it did, and affected a lot of people as it did. And this could have been, and this could be used as a biological agent to get out that causes these diseases to kill people with an intent as well. So just kind of keep that sentence up in the back of your head. This could happen. We already saw the COVID-19 outbreak, and that could have been a lot worse than what it actually was. And it was pretty bad initially, as it was anyways. Radiological and nuclear terrorism. There are only 2 publicly known incidents involving the use of a nuclear device. Some nations hold close ties with terrorist groups known as state-sponsored terrorism and have obtained some degree of nuclear capabilities. It is possible for a terrorist to secure radioactive material or waste to perpetrate an act of terror. So easier for terrorists to acquire and require less expertise to use. So recognizing a terrorist event indicators. So most acts of terror are covert. So be aware of your surroundings, understand possible risks for terrorism. So know the current level of threat issued by the federal government, what kind of threat has been issued to that area. Make sure you're aware of this information sent out by the National Terrorism Agency System, so NTAS. Make the following observations determine potential for terrorist attack. Type of location, type of call, how many patients or a number of patients, patient statements, and pre-incident indicators. You want to look at all those different things as part of your determination. So response actions, obviously scene safety, stage your vehicle from a safe distance, usually 1 to 2 blocks from the incident itself. Wait for law enforcement personnel to advise the scene has been made secure. If they have any doubt, do not enter. And the best location for staging is upwind, uphill, as most everything is usually pushing down, everything pushes down away from the wind, or pushes downwind. So you want to stay above that so the chemicals don't come into your area. Or if it is a spill, it's going to roll downhill instead of coming uphill towards you. So if this tractor trailer unit is leaking fuel, as you can see here, the hill is kind of, it looks like it's going this, oh, I don't have my thing on there. It is going, as you can see, the ambulance parked uphill. So if anything's leaking, it's going to roll down away. If this had a placard on it with gasoline or some type of other explosive like propane, way too close for the ambulance anyways. So back away until things are secured to the point where you can get in. Remember the following: failure to park your vehicle in a safe location can place you and your partner in danger. Always make an escape plan beforehand. How are we going to get out if something goes wrong? If your vehicle is blocked by another emergency vehicle or damaged by a secondary device or event, you'll be unable to provide victims with transportation or escape yourself. Right? So that's a big point. Whether you're doing firefighter rehab or you're at a bigger event, terrorism event, whatever it may be, you have to be able to have an exit plan with your ambulance to be able to transport patients out. So don't put yourself in a situation where you're going to get blocked in. Personal protection, responder safety. The best form of protection from a WMD agent is to prevent yourself from coming in contact with the agent. So greatest threats are contamination or cross-contamination. We do not take, if we know that the patient's infected, we do not take infected patients in the back of our ambulances until they are appropriately deconned so we can bring them in. And notify the hospital as well, especially if they have to do set up decon tents at the hospital prior to them going into the ERs as well. For people that may have gone in personal vehicles. As far as notification procedures go, inform dispatch the nature of the event, any additional resources may be required. They're going to estimate the number of patients, upwind or optimal route of approach. Establish a staging area. Trained responders in the proper personal protective equipment PPE are the only people or the only persons equipped to handle a WMD incident. So do we have the right appropriate people coming in, whether it be a hazmat team or whatever it may be? Request teams as early as possible because they take time to assemble. Some hazmat teams will take up to 3 hours to get a team together because a lot of them are all volunteers that come in, right? For county teams like that, for our areas. Keep in mind there may be more than one type of device or agent present as well. Establish command. until establish command until additional personnel arrive. You may function as medical branch director, triage supervisor, treatment supervisor, transfusion supervisor, logistics officer, and command and general staff. So they may assign you, as more people come in, you're going to take this branch here, you're going to have this division, you're going to have this role, and that's the way they're going to set things up. If ICS is in place, seek out the medical staging officer to receive an assignment. So find out where they are, and they're going to be able to give you an assignment as they receive it from command. We need another ambulance to this location. All right, staging goes, yeah, you can go here. This is the route you're going to get there. This is the exit route once you get there to get the patient out. That keeps things organized and move well. So reassessing scene safety. Remember, we always are reassessing scene safety from a simple medical call to terrorist attacks. So terrorists have been known to plant additional explosives to explode after the initial bomb. These are intended to hurt or injure responders and secure media coverage. Secondary devices may include various types of electronic equipment. So consistently assess and reassess the scene for safety. Look for anything that doesn't seem right. As far as chemical agents go, properties of the characteristics can be described as a liquid, gas, or a solid material. So persistency and volatility describe how long the agent will stay on the surface before it evaporates. It is not our job as EMS providers to know all these things about chemical agents, why hazmat teams exist, right? So persistent non-volatile agents can remain on the surface for long periods, usually longer than 24 hours. Non-persistent or volatile agents evaporate relatively fast when left on the surface of an optimal temperature range. Routes of exposure describe how the agents most effectively enter the body, right? So agencies with a vapor can enter through the respiratory tract, where agents with a contact hazard can enter through the skin. So have an idea of what's really going on. So the blister agents, our primary route of exposure is skin, and if left on the skin or clothing long enough, can produce vapors that can enter the respiratory tract. So if we have patients that have blister agents on them, we need to get them completely naked, get them cleaned off appropriately, whether it can be utilized with water or brushing. Again, you have to know what chemical you're dealing with as well. They can also cause burn-like blisters to form on the victim's skin and the respiratory tract. This consists of sulfur mustard, phosgene, oxime, CX gases, H gases, L gases. It could be anything, or powders, forms, whatever it may be. So there's a lot of different things that are out there, whether it be the ones listed to other ones that are not listed, that can cause more further harm to the body. So these blister agents usually cause most damage to damp or moist areas of the body, such as armpits, groin, or respiratory tract. So patients like this may require paramedic level care to be intubated to protect airway as well. As far as, and I'll show you the next picture, next slide, we have a picture of the skin irritation from chemical agents. But signs of exposure will be skin irritation, burning, or reddening of the skin. So immediate intense skin pain with L and CX gases, or formation of large blisters. The gray discoloration of the skin are a sign of permanent damage, seen with L and CX. Swollen and closed or irritated eyes. Permanent eye injury, including blindness. If vapors were inhaled, hoarseness or stridor, severe cough, hemoptysis or coughing up blood, and severe dyspnea. Sulfur mustard H is a brown, yellow, oily substance considered very persistent. It is absorbed into the skin and begins an irreversible process of damage of the cells. So distinct smell of garlic or mustard. Consider a mutagen, or which mutates, damages, and changes cellular DNA, leading to cellular death. The patient will develop a progressive reddening of the affected area, which will gradually develop into larger blisters, similar in shape and appearance to a thermal second-degree burn. So these do not contain the agent. However, the skin considered contaminated until decontamination has been performed. What else is happening is it also attacks the cells within the bone marrow and depletes the body's ability to produce white blood cells. What do white blood cells do? Just say white blood cells. Sorry, Matt. Did I said white, right? So, Tanya, right, to fight infection, right? That's what the white blood cells are there for, to help that destructive process to fight off the infection that's there. So, if you have a chemical agent that depletes your white blood cells, the body's able to reproduce those. It can't fight off any infection, which will kill you. Yeah, that's what I figured, Matt. You thought I said red. But if it was red blood cells, you were 100% correct. They carry oxygen. So leukocyte, or L, and phosgene oxium of CX produces blister wounds similar to mustard gas. This produces immediate, intense pain and discomfort. Tissue damage also occurs, but not secondary cellular injury. Right. The Viscin agent treatment. There is no antidotes available for H or CX exposure. British is an antidote for Agent L, but not carried by civilian EMS. So ensure decontamination before treatment is initiated, and gain IV access, initiate transport. Burn centers are the best equipped to handle wounds and subsequent infections produced by these agents as well. If you download the app Wiser, it has a lot of this information in there for you for treatment plans. And I believe it's a free app, if I remember correctly. WISER. So as far as choking agents go, or respiratory agents, they're gases that cause immediate harm. The primary route of exposure is through the respiratory tract. The damage to the lung tissue and fluid leaks into the lungs, causing edema and pulmonary fluid, producing respiratory-related symptoms like pulmonary edema, tachypnea, and dyspnea. Right, so we got to make sure we're treating this as well. Chlorine, or Cl, chlorine gases, were the first chemical agent ever used in warfare, which is a distinct odor of bleach and creates a green haze when released. Initially produced upper airway irritation and a choking sensation. Patients may later experience shortness of breath, chest tightness, hoarseness and stridor, gasping and coughing. And with serious exposures, pulmonary edema, complete airway obstruction, and death. Phosgene is a very potent agent with delayed onset of symptoms. Does not produce any severe inhalation. The odor produced is similar to freshly mown grass or hay. Initially, a mild exposure may cause nausea, chest tightness, severe cough, and dyspnea on exertion. Severe exposure may present with dyspnea at rest and excessive pulmonary edema. The treatment: remove the patient's contaminated atmosphere. Do not allow the patient to be active. There's no antidote available. Primary goals are ABCs: IV access, allow the patient to rest in a position of comfort with elevated head, and initiate prompt transport to the hospital. All right, nerve agents. Among the deadliest chemicals developed. It's extremely toxic and rapidly fatal. Can cause cardiac arrest within seconds to minutes of exposure. The class of chemical called organophosphates, found in household bug sprays, agricultural pesticides, and some industrial chemicals. What is the acronym for organophosphates to be able to tell if it's an organophosphate poisoning? Sludge them. Does anybody dare unmute and let me know what sludge them actually stands for? Who's got this? Yeah, you got the S, salivation, excessive saliva, right? Lacrimation. What is that? Yeah, excessive tearing. Urination. Salivation, lacrimation, urination. What's the D? Yeah, defecation. G would be GI symptoms, right? E is what? Emesis. And M. Meiosis, yep. So you can look at, there's different ones you can utilize. You can use dumbbells, sludge them, and the treatment for this would be what? What is the treatment if we get exposed to this? Duodote, exactly. And yeah, but no one carries them anymore, right? So New Hampshire said they had to have them on the ambulances, and it was an unfunded mandate. So they kept expired ones on the truck for a very long time. But there's two chemicals that are in a duodote, and it's 2-PAM and atropine are the two that you need because it will cause that significant bradycardia. You need the atropine to reverse it. All right. So we talked about that one there. So this blocks an essential enzyme in the nervous system, causing organs to become overstimulated and burn out. G agents came from the early nerve agents. The three G series agents are from high to low volatility. Sarin gas or sarin or GB is a highly volatile, colorless, odorless liquid, highly lethal with an LD50 of about 1 drop. Primarily a vapor hazard, especially dangerous in enclosed environments. So this is quickly absorbed through the skin and evaporates. So when on clothing, it has the effect of off-gassing. Soman or GD is twice as persistent as GB and 5 times as lethal. Has a fruity odor and generally no color. Both a contact and inhalation hazard, a unique additive causes it to bind to the cells and attack faster than any other agent. Tabin or GA is approximately 1/2 as lethal as GB and 36 times more persistent. Has a fruity smell and appearance similar to GB. Components used to manufacture it are easy to acquire, and the agent is easy to manufacture. This is a contact and inhalation hazard both. So the V agent or VX is a clear oily agent that has no color and looks like baby oil. The similar properties to G series, but more than 100 times more lethal than GB and extremely persistent. Remains relatively unchanged for weeks to months and easily absorbed to the skin. Only remaining oily residue is difficult to decontaminate. These produce similar but have the varying routes of entry, differ in lethal concentration dose. That's your L there, lethal concentration dose and volatility. Severity of symptoms depend on the route of and amount of exposure. So we use that acronym. We're talking about sludge dumbbells as well. Only a handful of medical conditions are associated with the bilateral excessively pinpoint pupils meiosis seen with nerve agent exposure. Seen quickly with vapor exposure as well, and may occur later after isolated skin exposure. Nerve agent treatment fatalities, my goodness. So fatalities occur as a result of respiratory complications. So you can increase the patient's chance of survival by providing airway and ventilatory support. Medical treatment may include a duodote autoinjector. Atropine blocks the nerve agent from affecting the body, and the military form of combination injector is the antidote treatment nerve agent autoinjector, ATNAA. So 2-PAM and then atropine are 2 medications, like I said, within that duodote. As far as cyanides go, hydrogen cyanide, AC, and cyanogen chloride, CK, affect the body's ability to use oxygen. Cyanide is a colorless gas with an odor similar to almonds. Its effects begin on cellular level and are rapidly seen in organs and systems. This kills within seconds to minutes, commonly found in many industrial settings. In low doses, these chemicals result in dizziness, lightheadedness, headache, and vomiting. Higher doses produce shortness of breath, gasping respirations, respiratory distress and arrest, tachypnea, tachycardia, flushed skin, altered mental status, coma, apnea, cardiac arrest, and seizures. Symptoms associated with inhalation of a large amount of cyanide will appear within several minutes. Death is likely if not properly treated. As far as treatment goes, there are several medications that act as antidotes. So all clothes must be removed to prevent off-gassing in the ambulance. Trained and protected personnel must decontaminate any patient who has been exposed to a liquid contamination before you can initiate treatment. ABC's IV access. Keep in mind that when I say IV access, cardiac monitoring also. Remember, that's on an AEMT national scope, but more than just IV access, cardiac monitor. Mild effects resolved by removing patient from the source of the contamination and administering supplemental oxygen. Severe exposure will require aggressive oxygenation and ventilation. If no antidote is available, transport immediately. As far as biological agents, most diseases caused by biologic agents are similar to other illnesses, grouped as viruses, bacteria, and neurotoxins, and spread in various ways. Dissemination means by which the agent is spread, disease vector, an animal that spreads the disease, and communicability is how the disease can spread. When communicability is high and the person is considered contagious. Typically, the routine standard precautions are enough to prevent contamination from contagious biologic organisms. Remember, there has to be an incubation period as well, the time between the person becoming exposed to the agent and appearance of the first symptoms, an incubation period that sits in your system. Although you may have not exhibit signs and symptoms, the person may still be contagious. And the one we just had, like I said before, COVID. It could be in your system, you'd be fine for the first couple of days. The next thing you know, you're starting to develop some symptoms of the headache, sore throat, and you start having GI symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea, and then you start getting into fevers, potential respiratory distress, pneumonia. A lot of that stuff progressively gets worse. And now that we have some treatments for it, obviously things are getting a little bit better. But when it first came out, it was out there for it. You know what I mean? So as far as more of the virus. So germs that require living hosts to multiply and survive cannot survive outside that host itself. So the virus invades healthy cells and replicates itself to spread throughout the host. These move from host to host by direct methods such as respiratory droplets or vectors. Remember, the vector is an agent that acts as a carrier or transporter. Some have vaccines, but there is no treatment other than certain antiviral medications. So, coronavirus. In 2020, the virus mutated and became easily communicable and caused worldwide pandemic. To prevent further spread, many countries, including the United States, instituted quarantine, stay-at-home orders, and then closure of all non-essential businesses. Healthcare workers were faced with protecting themselves from contracting COVID-19 while caring for the critically ill patients. So we were wearing not just N95 masks, but we were wearing full hood systems and everything else, and helmet hood systems to help us be able to breathe without having to wear that mask for longer periods of time to be able to treat patients, fully encapsulated in these different suits to protect ourselves. Smallpox is highly contagious, so make sure you wear exam gloves and a high-efficiency particulate air respirator and eye protection. Before the rash and blisters show, a high fever, body aches, and headaches will present. Size, shape, and location of the lesions differ from other infections, as you can see in the picture here. Viral hemorrhagic fevers, or VHFs, a group of disease caused by Ebola, Rift Valley, Marburg, and yellow fever viruses as well. This causes blood to seep out of the tissues and blood vessels. So initially, the patient will have flu-like symptoms progressing more serious symptoms such as internal or external hemorrhaging. All standard precautions must be taken. Mortality rates vary depending on the strain of the virus, the patient's age, and health conditions, as well as the availability of the modern healthcare system as well. So as you can see in other third world countries, we may not see a higher treatment for these patients in different countries. So bacteria do not require a host to multiply and live. They can be treated with antibiotics. So most begin with the flu-like symptoms, like anthrax, like pulmonary and cutaneous as well, caused by a bacterium that lies dormant in a spare in a spore or a protective shell. Routes of entry will be inhalation, cutaneous or gastrointestinal, and antibiotics can be used for anthrax. Bubonic and pneumonic plague are natural vectors that are affected rodents and fleas. Bubonic plague affects the lymphatic system in your body, so lymph nodes become infected and start to grow, and the glands in the nodes will grow large and round, forming, as you can see, right up in here, the different bumps and whatnot up here, and swelling. The lymph nodes start to grow. Left untreated, this may lead to sepsis and death. It's not contagious. The pneumonic plague is a lung infection, also known as the plague pneumonia. This is contagious and has a much higher death rate than the bubonic form. Neurotoxins are the deadliest substances known to humans, produced from plants, marine animals, molds, and bacteria. Routes of exposure in ingestion, inhalation from aerosols or injection. Not contagious and have a faster onset of symptoms. So botulinum toxin is the most potent neurotoxin. This affects the nervous system's ability to function, so voluntary muscle control diminishes, eventually causes muscle paralysis and leads to respiratory arrests. Ricin, not as deadly as the one we previously discussed, the botulinum, but 5 times more lethal than VX, derived from mash left from the castor bean. So, interesting story about this one too. This causes pulmonary edema, respiratory circulatory failure. Extremely toxic by many routes of exposure, including inhalation. It can also be done through ingestion as well. It's least toxic by the oral route, but again, can be given that way. And I'll tell you the story behind that one. So signs and symptoms of ricin ingestion are fever, chills, headache, muscle aches, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, severe abdominal cramping, dehydration, gastrointestinal bleeding, necrosis of the liver, spleen, kidneys, and GI tract. Ricin inhalation, as you can see, it's the same fever, chills, nausea, local irritation of the eyes, nose, and throat, profuse sweating, headache, muscle aches, non-productive cough, chest pain, dyspnea, pulmonary edema, severe lung inflammation, cyanosis, seizure, respiratory failure. And the treatment for this is really supportive. So interesting about ricin. You guys remember what the ricin incident in Vermont about maybe 4 years ago, 5 years ago? You guys ever see that at all? So if you look up Vermont Nursing Home in Shelburne, Vermont. I was on shift that day in Vermont in the town of Charlotte. I was working there that day when I was the chief up there. And we got dispatched to the nursing home in Shelburne for multiple patients not feeling well. And we transported a lady to the hospital. Same symptoms as you can see: fever, chills, headache, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal cramping. She was very dehydrated. So we dropped her off, not thinking anything of it. And she's at the hospital, and she says, "Yeah, I'm making ricin in my room." No one believed her at all. Not one person believed anything she was saying. And then they started looking up the signs and symptoms of ricin, and she had all the same symptoms that were there. So they sent PD to her room, and they found that she was growing castor beans and making ricin. And she was putting it in all the foods of all the elderly people in the nursing home, trying to see how bad it was going to get before she took it herself, and she wanted to use it as a suicide. So, interesting story. If you look it up online, it's all there. Just Shelburne, Vermont Nursing Home, ricin. You'll be able to find it. So, interesting story. So, roles of the AEMT during the biological event. Really, it's surveillance. Looking around what you have, what's going on. We're going to monitor the patients presenting to the emergency departments and alternative care facilities. We're going to recording of EMS call volume, monitoring the use of over-the-counter medications. The role of EMS in syndromic surveillance is valuable in overall tracking of a biological terrorist event or infection disease outbreaks. So they start noticing like how many patients are going to the hospital for the same thing over and over and over again. Look at these different numbers, and it's something starting to become more widespread. If one patient comes in as patient 0, we really don't pick up on just that one, unless it's something severe where they can start doing more testing in the hospital and say, okay, this is this, right? But they start seeing one, then another, then multiple more coming in, and becomes more of a trend that we're seeing. And we can say, wait a minute, something's just not right here, and what's out in the air. Or if you have like bad water in an apartment building, for example, you get multiple people that are sick, will cause people to go out and take a look and see what's really going on. Points of distribution or strategic national stockpile. Facilities established for the mass distribution of antibiotics, chemical antidotes, antitoxins, vaccinations, other medications and supplies. Point being like poisonous snakes. We're not going to carry a lot of antivenoms in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, but down in Florida, they're going to have higher stockpiles because of the need. Strategic national stockpiling. Have a delivery time of 12 hours anywhere in the country for these, what they call push packs, maybe called to assist in delivery of any kind of medication to the public. But again, yeah, pods can also be smaller scale and take from the form of food. Yeah, exactly. So radiological nuclear devices, ionizing radiation is energy emitted in the form of rays or particles. We found in radioactive materials that are unstable and attempts to stabilize itself by changing its structure in a natural process called decay. As a substance decays, it gives off radiation until it stabilizes. Energy emitted from a strong radiological source, and we'll go over the alpha, beta. So alpha is the least harmful generating type and cannot move through most objects. Beta radiation is slightly more penetrating than alpha, requires a layer of clothing to stop it. Gamma rays are far faster and stronger than alpha and beta radiation, and neuron particles are among the most powerful forms of radiation. So the biggest thing with radiological stuff is time, distance, and shielding. Time, distance, and shielding are the three things to look for radiological. All right, so you can kind of look here. So figure A is alpha, B is beta. And you can see C is gamma rays. And then you can see the neuron as well. So neuron will go through that shield there, where gamma rays bounce through a person and can bounce off the metal behind it or objects. The sources of radiological material, so used for purposes that benefit humankind, such as medicine, killing germs, or food, in food irradiation, or construction work, can be found in hospitals as well, with radiological departments, colleges, universities, chemical and industrial sites, nuclear power plants as well. You can find some radiological materials. Radiologic dispersal devices, RDDs, are containers designed to disperse radioactive material. So a dirty bomb that has potential to injure people with not only the radioactive material, but also an explosive material used to deliver it. The destructive capability is limited to the explosives detached to it and is an ineffective weapons of mass destruction device. Nuclear energy is artificially made by altering or splitting radioactive atoms. The result is an immense amounts of energy that usually takes the form of heat. Nuclear material is used in medicine, weapons, naval vessels, and power plants, and gives off all forms of radiation, including neutrons. Nuclear weapons keep only in secure facilities throughout the world. Likelihood of a nuclear attack is extremely remote. So the whereabouts of many of these nuclear devices are unknown, and a small suitcase-sized nuclear weapons are called special atomic demolition munitions, so SADMS, or suitcase nukes. Suitcase nukes are designed to destroy individual targets like buildings, bridges, tunnels, and large ships. Symptomatology is effects of radiation exposure vary depending on the amount of radiation received and route of exposure. This can be introduced by all routes of entry as well as through the body's irradiation. Some common signs of radiation poisoning are listed in your books on 42-11. Medical agents, so being exposed to radiation sources does not make a patient contaminated or radioactive. However, when the patient has a radioactive source on their body, they are contaminated and must initially be cared for by a hazmat responder. As a patient is decontaminated and there is no threat to you exists, you may begin treatment with ABCs and treat any burns or trauma. Always use appropriate PPE and use plastic bags to secure body fluids obtained from the patient. As far as protective measures go, there are no suits or protective gear that will completely shield you from radiation. The best ways to protect yourself, like I said before, is time, distance, and shielding. All right, almost done. Incendiary and explosive devices come in various shapes and sizes. So be able to identify a potential device, notify the proper authorities, and safely evacuate the area. And then remember, there's also a possibility of a secondary device, where those are designed to create more media coverage and or also hurt first responders. Mechanism of injury is a type of severity of wounds primarily depend on the patient's distance from the explosion itself. So there are 5 types of blast injuries. One is the primary blast injury caused solely by the direct effects of the pressure wave. There's a secondary blast injury, penetrating or non-penetrating injury struck by flying debris. The tertiary blast injury, which results from whole body displacement and subsequent impact on the environmental objects, right? Then we have quaternary blast devices, or any other injury caused by the blast, and quaternary blast devices caused by explosion or by exposure to toxic materials associated with radiation, bacteria, and or chemicals. So the physics of an explosion, so when a substance is detonated, a solid or liquid is chemically converted into a large volume of gas under high pressure with resulting explosive energy release. So that explosion energy comes out. This generates a pressure pulse in the shape of a spherical blast wave that expands in all directions from the point of explosion. That's that first hit, right? Then flying debris and high winds commonly cause blunt and penetrating trauma. So that's the secondary part of it, where you're getting all the debris hitting you as well. So there's a lot of tissues at risk. So hollow organs are most susceptible to pressure changes. There's nothing inside, they're hollow. Junction between the tissues and different densities are also exposed tissues prone to injury. The ear is most sensitive to blast injuries. Primarily pulmonary blast injuries occur as contusions and hemorrhages in the lungs, the pulmonary system. So the blast lung is a very most common cause of death in people who survive the initial explosion. So blast lung also characterized by a clinical triad of apnea, bradycardia, and hypotension. Solid organs may be injured by secondary missiles or a hurled body. So when you hit the ground pretty hard, not the blast waves itself, but you connecting to the ground, or a projectile going through into your abdominal cavity or anywhere where there's an organ. Hollow organs may be injured by similar mechanisms as our lung tissue as well. So to finish up, neurological injuries and head trauma are the most common causes of death. So subarachnoid and subdural hematomas, head injuries hitting the ground, permanent or transient neurological deficit secondary to concussion, intracerebral bleeding, or air embolus. So you may have instant but transient unresponsiveness with or without retrograde amnesia, bradycardia, hypotension, and extremity injuries as well, including traumatic amputations. So turn this off really quick.